Let's take a look at the stories inside the papers, why don't we? Jonathan Gibson joins me now, political commentator with Young Voices UK. Morning, Jonathan.
Good morning, Rosie.
How are
Great to
you
be here.
doing? Good. It's a pleasure to have
Fantastic.
you. Lots of the papers are talking about a story I haven't mentioned yet, and strike action is never far from the agenda. And what we've seen is a significant escalation and a ramping up. Cancer and A&E nurses are going to join a 48-hour walkout next month. Why are they doing this, and what is the solution?
No, this is a serious escalation of strikes, and there's news that nurses will refuse to provide either cancer treatment or coverage of A&E during a 48-hour strike in March. So people with really, really significant medical problems won't be treated during that time period. And I think there's several reasons for this. They were offered a 4.5 pay rise last year, but the government is refusing to reopen negotiations, and there has been a big escalation both in the number of nurses striking. So during February, or at the start of April, there was 120 NHS employers. There was 73, and now it's moved to 120. And there's all areas of the NHS being affected rather than just particular areas. This is coinciding with other strikes, such as rail strikes. And they're really, really trying to put pressure on the government and build as much as they can. This is basically the biggest card they've played yet, and then we'll have to see what the outcome is. This is really serious.
Nurses are looking for a pay rise above the sort of 4.5% they were offered for this financial year. They say the government's refusing to reopen negotiations. There are question marks how serious this can get and to what extent they're prepared to put patient safety at risk to try and engineer the pay deal that they want. Do you think, Jonathan, that the public see the strike action of nurses differently to say they do some of the other sets of industrial action we've been suffering with?
Yeah, Rosie, I do. I think if you look at the polls, actually, they are the most supportive of nurses' strikes. I think everyone who's been sort of helped by nurses through the NHS has an appreciation of them and the work that they do. And I think people can recognise, the fact that they have one of the lowest pays across Europe, nurses across Europe, and they haven't received a pay rise in many, many years. In fact, in terms of real wages, they've been receiving a falling wage. So I think people can recognise, struggles that they're facing, the struggles that they faced during COVID, the fact that we clapped for them, and the fact that we recognised the hard work they were doing, but then sort of won't recognise that work with equal rises in pay to cover, the rising cost of living crisis and the rise of inflation. So I think people are sympathising them potentially more than with other strikes and industrial action.
Let's talk about Nicola Bulley, shall we? Vanished 3 weeks ago today, and the investigation by Lancashire Police has really been widely criticised. Now, Suella Braverman's demanding an explanation over the release of very private information about her. How do you see the relationship of the press trying to cover this story, and particularly how the police are managing it?
Yes, I was really noticing it. It's quite fascinating in a way, the fact that we are scrutinising, and rightly so, the fact that there seems to be information released about Billy's private life, which just does not seem relevant to the case, in my opinion. Just doesn't seem important. I don't think it will help find her, and I think I'm in the same camp as many MPs, both across the Labour and the Conservative Party, who are questioning why this is happening. Will any of it actually be useful for the investigation? So there is an explanation that's been demanded by Suella Braverman from Lancashire Police over the release of this information. It seems to be, almost victim blaming in some ways. Seems to be focusing on, issues and the private life of the individual rather than actually how can we help support and find her. So I think it's really difficult, but at the same time, in covering the story, there's inevitably going to be her details, which are again rising to the forefront of the conversation, which is also, it poses a challenge. How do we go about this? How do you address this topic in a way that is important and will hold people to account and do the job that journalists do.
For her family as well, who said, look, we need to have these appalling rumours stop immediately. The story goes on, and for the family, they need this story front and centre, and for there to be press attention, but attention that helps rather than hurts the investigation. That's the very fine line. We'll have more details on the request from Suella Braverman later today on Times Radio. Let's look at Times Radio exclusive, the sort of repercussions of it, the details of how British Gas, some of the companies they'd hired, how they were behaving. They reported record profits yesterday. And there is an argument being made by some people in the papers today to say, these profits, maybe they should be used to compensate victims of the prepay meter scandal. Do you think that would be appropriate action?
I think that is a very reasonable claim. I think the fact that companies like British Gas made £3.3 billion in profit last year, benefiting from the rising energy prices after the invasion of Ukraine. So this isn't through dynamic innovation and investment to make necessarily their structure and their business model significantly more efficient. This is benefiting off of a war, and this is benefiting in huge amounts a way which, at a time in which there's a cost of living crisis, people are really struggling and finding it really difficult to, simply choose between putting food on the table or heating their home. And so I think I can clearly understand why people are getting quite upset about this and find it quite offensive in some ways, that these companies are making so much money. So there's high electricity prices, there's bumper rewards for shareholders with £118 million in dividends, 300 million to buy buyback program. So I think definitely there are lots of calls for this, and I can certainly understand why there'd be calls to, tax or use these profits to cover scandals.
Would you support a greater windfall tax?
At the moment, yes. No, I would. I think we need to ensure that companies, even though it seems quite high in terms of quite high taxation, these companies are not, getting record profits because of anything other than a war. They're making record profits at a time, and people at the top of the business are making incredible amounts of money at a time when it needs to be redistributed, and inequality is a growing problem in our country. So, yes, I would.
Page 5 of the Times today have got a picture of what looks like two elderly men with sort of masks on, and they're robbers. They have been unmasked by their own disguise. So they had these sort of latex, very realistic masks on to make them look like old men. And it turns out they've been caught out by the masks they were wearing in themselves. Explain to us what happened, Jonathan.
No, this is a really, really funny story in which, well, funny in some ways, but if you look at the photo of the two men, the masks are actually incredible. They do not look like masks. They look very realistic. But then when you compare it to the mugshots of the actual individuals, they're completely different. This is two brothers who staged an armed robbery at a jewelry store while they were disguised as elderly men. And their DNA has been found on these lifelike latex masks, which several weeks later, actually, there was a sort of stop and search in their car, and police found these masks, and so therefore from that we're able to identify them and capture them and arrest them. So I think it's really, really interesting that the identical mask and clothing identical to those worn by the suspects in the robbery were found in the car, with knives, screwdrivers, hatchets, fake number plates, etc. So I think they've basically just been caught out by their own disguise and come back to bite them.
It absolutely has. And the stills from the CCTV, if you grab a copy of the paper, you can see it today, are quite extraordinary. As you say, they do look really, really lifelike. They're the sort of whole head covering masks. So they've got sort of different hairstyles, and then wearing the sort of medical mask on top of that. It serves them right, and some brilliant detective work, which means those people have been charged. Finally, Jonathan, these really do make me groan, but apparently puns that make you groan are the funniest joke around. Are they really?
Well, this was a questionable one at a Friday morning, 5 a.m. I'm not sure I'm convinced by this, but apparently, according to scientists, puns that elicit, an eye roll or a grunt or whatever are supposed to be funnier than ones which, don't do that. People that, roll their eyes or have a grin of exasperation, which is probably what I'm doing right now at reading this paper, because I find puns quite annoying, but, each to their own, I guess.
They are. It's like the classic dad joke. They really are so terrible. My poor dad has got 4 daughters, and none of us hugely appreciated his humour. The worst being when I would say, "Oh, Dad, my light bulb's gone. Can you sort it?" And he'd go, "Gone? Where's it gone?" And it's like, "No, you're so annoying, so annoying."
Yeah, no,
I know.
I can definitely relate.
That was very frustrating. Jonathan, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure going through the papers with you this morning. Jonathan Gibson, political commentator with Young Voices UK.